The Colorado Territory sun hung low and unforgiving over the Gable farmhouse when the shouting began. Dust clung to the air like shame, settling into every crack of the weathered wood. Inside the cramped parlor, Eleanor Gable stood with her hands clenched at her sides, her modest dress pulling tight across shoulders that trembled despite her best efforts to remain still. Her mother's voice cut through the heavy silence, like a blade through rotted cloth. 2 years married, and not a single child to show for it. You think we raised you for this? To be sent back like spoiled milk? Eleanor flinched, but kept her eyes fixed on a worn spot in the floorboards. She had learned long ago that looking up only invited more cruelty. Her father, Samuel Gable, sat heavily in his corner chair, arms folded across his broad chest. His weathered face bore the hardness of a man who measured worth in acres and offspring. "You came home empty-handed," he growled. "No dowry returned, no grandchild, nothing but disgrace. You're a shadow in this house, girl. A burden with a stamp on it that says useless." Eleanor blinked rapidly, but the tears came anyway, hot and unwelcome. She had tried to explain once, when they dragged her off the wagon after Thomas Brennan's family shoved her out without ceremony. But they hadn't wanted her words then, and they certainly didn't want them now. Her mother spun around, skirt swirling with barely contained fury. "Do you know how many tongues wagged at church last Sunday? They said Thomas's family celebrated the divorce. Said he already had a new girl lined up, someone younger, someone fertile. You ruined your chance at a future, Eleanor. You ruined our standing in this community." "Mama, I didn't," Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Quiet." Her father's bark made her jump. "You think we care to hear excuses? Your womb failed, girl. That's all anyone will ever remember. No man wants a wife who cannot carry his name forward. You're damaged goods, and damaged goods don't fetch a second price." Her mother crossed to the mantel and retrieved a folded letter, thrusting it into Eleanor's trembling hands. "Jonas Halden," she announced, her tone sharp with finality. "He owns cattle and land up near the foothills. No family, no children, no one to cook or keep house. He needed help with the ranch work, and we offered you. It clears the debt your failed marriage left us with, and it clears this house of your shame." Eleanor stared at the paper, her vision blurring. It wasn't a letter of courtship or affection. It was a transaction, cold and impersonal as a bill of sale. "You're sending me away?" she whispered, disbelief making her voice crack. "Like livestock? You think we can afford to keep you here?" Her father snarled, rising from his chair. "Feed you, clothe you, protect what's left of your reputation when you already shattered it." "I'm your daughter." She wanted to scream, but the words died in her throat. "You're a burden," he said flatly, and the room fell silent as a tomb. Outside, a wagon rattled to a stop in the yard. The driver didn't bother knocking. He simply waited, patient as death. Eleanor stood motionless for a long moment, then slowly lifted the small travel sack she hadn't yet unpacked from her return. It held no keepsakes, no cherished memories, just a spare dress, some undergarments, and a single Bible with curled corners from too much desperate reading. "Will he be at the church?" she asked, her voice hollow as an empty well. "For the ceremony?" Her mother's laugh was bitter. "He's not coming. He sent the wagon. That should tell you enough about what kind of marriage this will be." As Eleanor stepped toward the door, her father called after her, not unkindly, but with absolute finality. "Don't come back, Eleanor. There's nothing here for you anymore." She climbed into the wagon without looking back. The road stretched long and silent before her, disappearing into the purple shadows of distant mountains. The sun dropped low behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of loss and endings. Her hands turned cold despite the lingering heat of the day. By the time they arrived at the Halden Ranch, darkness had fallen like a curtain. A young ranch hand helped her down with a respectful nod and pointed toward the main house, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Eleanor knocked once. The door creaked open slowly. Jonas Halden stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with wind-worn eyes that revealed nothing. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, exposing forearms marked by sun and labor. He looked at her for a long, measuring moment, then stepped aside without a word. "Room's down the hall," he said quietly, his voice like gravel and smoke. "First door on the left. No welcome. No smile. No pretense of something this wasn't." Eleanor walked past him into a house that smelled of dust and coffee and profound distance. The door shut behind her with a soft, final thud that seemed to echo in her chest. That night, she sat alone on the edge of a strange bed in a strange room. Moonlight barely reached the floorboards, leaving her in shadows. No ceremony, no vows, no promises. Just silence and the crushing weight of being unwanted. She looked down at her hands, work-worn and empty, and whispered to the darkness, "I am a wife now. But it feels like I've just been delivered, like a debt marked paid." Part 2. The silent kindness. The wind changed direction 2 days after Eleanor arrived at the Halden Ranch, turning sharp and cold with the promise of early frost. She rose before dawn each morning, tied her apron with numb fingers, and kept her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. She cooked, she cleaned, she scrubbed floors until her knees ached and washed clothes by the creek until her knuckles split and bled from the icy water. She moved through the house and yard like a ghost, seen but never truly acknowledged, heard but never listened to. It was a familiar feeling, one she had worn like a second skin in her first marriage. Jonas Halden didn't speak much either. He rose with the sun, worked until well past dark, and when he finally came into the house each evening, he washed his hands at the basin, ate whatever she'd prepared in silence, and nodded once before disappearing down the hall to his own room. Their conversations, if they could be called that, consisted of practical necessities. Salt's on the left. You forgot your gloves by the fence. There's more firewood stacked out back. Eleanor didn't mind the silence. It was infinitely better than questions, better than pity, better than the constant scrutiny she'd endured before. She kept her sleeves rolled down to hide the red cracks in her skin. She mended Jonas's shirts with neat, invisible stitches, taking pride in work that went unnoticed. She even boiled lard and lavender into a healing balm for the horse's legs, never once thinking to use it on her own damaged hands. Then one morning, a small wooden box appeared on the kitchen table. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment before carefully lifting the lid. Inside lay a pair of soft leather gloves, perfectly sized for her hands. No note accompanied them. No explanation. Just the gloves, supple and warm. She said nothing about it. Neither did Jonas. Later that week, she found a clean cloth folded on her pillow. It wasn't one of hers. The fabric smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar, masculine and oddly comforting. In the corner, stitched in careful thread, was her name, Eleanor. Her throat tightened, but she folded the cloth and tucked it into her apron pocket without comment. Then, on a Thursday, after her hands had bled freely while scrubbing the porch steps, she discovered a tin of salve by the wash basin. It was strong and cool, wrapped in brown paper with no identifying marks. When she glanced through the window, Jonas was outside chopping wood, his back turned as if he'd never seen her limp inside, holding her damaged hands. She wore the gloves after that, used the salve, kept the cloth close. But she never acknowledged these small kindnesses aloud, and neither did he. In town, the whispers followed her like a persistent shadow. She heard them clearly, though the speakers never bothered to lower their voices. "She's the one who got sent back, right? The barren one. Must be nice, trading shame for land and a roof." Wonder what she had to promise that rancher. At first, Eleanor's chest tightened painfully when the cruel words reached her ears. Then, gradually, the pain dulled, like stepping barefoot onto frozen ground. The initial sting gave way to numbness, a protective layer she wrapped around herself. The worst part wasn't the cruelty itself, but the casual nature of it. The way people discussed her failure as if she were deaf or simply didn't matter enough to warrant discretion. She passed two women outside the general store one afternoon, and one leaned close to her companion with a sharp laugh. I hear she sleeps in a different room from him. Figures. Who'd want to share a bed with damaged goods? Eleanor kept walking. Her basket gripped so tightly the woven handle left marks in her palm. That night, she scrubbed the cast iron pan so hard the seasoning came off in black flakes. Her hand shook. She dropped the scrubbing cloth into the sink and pressed her palms flat against the counter, fighting for composure. She had come here expecting silence and solitude. She hadn't expected to feel small again, to be transported back to that other house, beneath that other roof, where they'd stared at her with judgment in their eyes and condemnation on their lips. Jonas must have heard the rumors. It was a small town, and gossip traveled faster than wildfire. But he said nothing about it. He didn't defend her publicly, didn't correct the whisperers, didn't offer reassurances. He didn't touch her, didn't ask probing questions, didn't show her even the polite gestures a husband might offer his bride. And yet, every evening, the boots she left by the door were cleaned and oiled. The kettle was already warming on the stove when she rose in the dark hours before dawn. On her worst days, when exhaustion made her careless, the apron she'd left hanging on the fence was brought back inside, neatly folded on the table. One morning, she found a fresh bar of lavender soap wrapped in linen on the kitchen windowsill. A small thing, almost nothing. But she stood there, staring at it for 5 full minutes, her vision blurring. Eleanor didn't cry. She had spent enough tears to fill a well and had nothing left to show for it. But that night she added an extra log to the fire before Jonas came in from the evening chores. She set out a second spoon beside his bowl of stew and poured him coffee without being asked. Then she waited. Though she couldn't have said what for Don, she simply waited. And somehow, in the silence between them, something imperceptible began to shift. Part 3. The weight of the past. Market smelled of rain-damp wood and autumn apples when Eleanor ventured into town for supplies. She moved quietly between the stalls, her basket light, her gaze lowered as always. She had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible in a world that had already decided she was too much trouble. Near the grain sacks, a voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife through silk. Well, well. Eleanor Gable. Or is it Holden now? Eleanor turned slowly. A woman in a blue calico bonnet smiled with all the warmth of a winter frost. Miriam Crowley, a cousin to Thomas's sister, someone who had always delighted in other people's misfortunes. You're looking well enough, Miriam continued, her tone falsely sweet. Thomas is doing much better too, you know? Married again just last month. Pretty young thing, sturdy looking. The kind who looks like she'll have no trouble bearing children. Imagine that. The words struck harder than a physical blow. Eleanor managed a weak smile that barely touched her lips. She gripped the edge of her basket until the weave bit into her fingers. Please give him my best wishes, she said quietly. Then turned and walked away before the burning behind her eyes could spill over into tears. That night, alone in her small room, it all came flooding back with the force of a dam breaking. The other house. The medicine cabinet filled with tinctures and powders and fertility drafts. The tin cups lined up each morning, filled with bitter concoctions she'd forced down while they watched. The endless restrictions. Don't lift heavy pots. Don't drink cold water. Don't read after sunset. Don't ride horses. Don't laugh too hard. Don't. The calendar marked in red ink. Each month's failure circled like a condemnation. The shame of every new month that arrived empty, announced by her body's betrayal, and Thomas's mother with her cold voice and colder hands, standing over her like a judge pronouncing sentence. If you can't give him a child, what are you good for? Not once had they questioned Thomas. Not once had they suggested he see a doctor, that perhaps the fault lay elsewhere. It was always Eleanor who was poked and prodded, whispered about behind doors that never quite closed all the way, examined by physicians who looked at her with pity and disapproval in equal measure. And on the final day, the day they'd sent her home in disgrace, the last thing she'd heard was Thomas's mother screaming down the hallway, "You're a drywall girl. A disgrace to womanhood. May you never poison another house with your presence." Eleanor woke from the memory gasping, drenched in cold sweat. Her hands were clenched so tightly around the quilt that her fingers had gone numb. She lay still for a long time, waiting for the ghosts to fade back into the darkness where they belonged. The next morning, she threw herself into work with desperate energy. She split kindling, stacked firewood, carried water buckets. Anything to keep her mind occupied and her memories at bay. But when the chickens broke loose from their coop, squawking and flapping in a wild frenzy, her last shred of composure snapped like a dried twig. She managed to corral them back, but the noise, the chaos, the suffocating silence of her own unspoken pain, it all became too much at once. Eleanor sank down in the corner of the coop, her back pressed against the rough boards. Her shoulders shook, though no sound emerged. This wasn't the loud, hot crying of a young girl seeking comfort. This was the silent, choking grief of a woman who had swallowed too much pain to scream any more. It lodged in her throat. It cracked in her chest like ice breaking. A shadow fell across the dirt. She didn't look up, but she felt him there. Felt his presence like a change in air pressure. Jonas. He stood just beyond the wire fence, not entering her space, not demanding anything. His voice came low and steady when he finally spoke. "You want a few days to rest? Forget the chickens. Forget the ranch work. Forget what folks in town say. Just rest, Eleanor." She looked up, her eyes swollen but dry now, tears spent. Her lips parted, but no answer came. She couldn't remember the last time someone had offered her permission to simply stop, to exist without proving her worth through constant labor. Jonas didn't look at her the way others did, not like something broken that needed fixing, not like a problem requiring a solution. He looked at her like a person, like a woman who deserved space to grieve, to heal, to simply exist without explanation or apology. He nodded once, then walked away, leaving her with the gift of his absence, the grace of not having to perform or pretend. That evening, Eleanor washed up slowly, her hands still trembling slightly. She diced carrots, peeled potatoes, stirred beef into thick broth. The familiar motions grounded her, brought her back into her body. Jonas didn't mention what he'd witnessed, but when she set his plate down that night, she paused. Her eyes held his for a moment longer than usual, and in that silence, something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but understanding, recognition. The smallest beginning of something that might, given time and patience, grow into trust. Part 4. The moment everything changed. The sun hung sharp and bright above the town rooftops when Jonas and Eleanor drove the wagon in for supplies. The streets bustled with more activity than usual, wagons creaking along rutted roads, voices drifting from storefronts, children chasing each other through clouds of dust. Eleanor kept close to Jonas's side as they approached the mercantile, her eyes lowered, the shopping list clutched in her hand, though she'd long since memorized every item on it. As Jonas stepped inside the store, Eleanor turned toward the town well, needing a moment alone to breathe. to gather herself before facing the inevitable stares and whispers. That's when she heard it. "James!" "No, wait, James, stop." A woman's panicked voice shattered the afternoon calm. Eleanor's head snapped up in time to see a small boy, no more than 4 years old, darting across the main road. He was chasing a paper kite, its tail fluttering wildly in the wind, laughing with the pure abandon of a child who didn't understand danger. His little boots slipped in the loose gravel. He stumbled, caught himself, kept running. Down the hill, a delivery wagon barreled forward, the driver shouting, reins flailing uselessly. The horses had spooked at something, their eyes rolling white with terror, hooves pounding the earth as they thundered out of control. Everything slowed. Eleanor dropped her basket. She didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't consider the consequences or her own safety. She ran. The child had almost reached the center of the road when Eleanor lunged forward, arms outstretched. She caught him around his small middle, twisting her body to shield him as they tumbled together into the shallow drainage ditch beside the road. The wagon thundered past, so close that flying dirt and gravel pelted them. The ground shook, the air filled with the smell of sweat and fear and horses. Then, silence. Eleanor's breath came in sharp, painful gasps. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, her knees scraped raw, her palms bleeding from where they'd hit the rocky ground. But her arms stayed locked around the boy, protective and unyielding. He cried softly against her shoulder, stunned but unharmed. She rocked him gently, instinctively, her lips pressed to his hair. "It's all right," she whispered, the words coming from somewhere deep and ancient within her. "You're safe now. Mama's got you." Mama's here, sweet boy. She didn't even realize she was saying it. The words rose unbidden from a well of longing so deep she'd tried to seal it shut. Her voice cracked with something fierce and tender all at once. A mother's love for a child that wasn't hers. Could never be hers. The boy's mother reached them moments later, crying and breathless, her face pale with terror. She knelt beside them in the dirt, hands trembling violently. "Oh God. Oh, thank you, ma'am. Thank you. My baby, my sweet baby." But the woman stopped short as she looked at Eleanor's face. There was something in her eyes that startled the mother into sudden silence, a sorrow too vast for the moment, a hunger that went deeper than words. Eleanor finally looked up, awareness returning like cold water. "He's fine," she said softly, carefully transferring the boy into his mother's waiting arms. She brushed back his dark hair with shaking, bloody fingers. "Just hold him tight now. Hold him close." The mother took her child and backed away slowly, still watching Eleanor with the unsettled expression of someone who had witnessed a stranger cry in a language they somehow understood. Across the street, Jonas had been standing motionless the entire time. He hadn't moved when Eleanor ran, hadn't called out, hadn't rushed forward. He had simply watched, arms at his sides, jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Thought he had seen everything. The way she'd moved without hesitation, the way she'd held that child, the words she'd whispered. He had seen the truth written plainly across her face, the longing, the grief, the love that had nowhere to go. That night, the house settled into its usual quiet. Eleanor said nothing during supper, keeping her eyes fixed on her plate. When she finished eating, she excused herself early, exhaustion pulling at her bones. When she reached her bedroom door, she stopped, there, placed carefully on the floor just inside the threshold. Saturday, a small wooden doll. It was roughly carved but shaped with care, with 2 button eyes and a painted smile, no bigger than her hand. Eleanor stared at it, her breath catching painfully in her throat. There was no note, no explanation, but somehow it spoke louder than any words could have. She bent down slowly, picked it up with trembling hands. Her fingers curled around the small figure, as if it might dissolve like morning mist dot. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, the doll cradled in her lap, and leaned forward until her forehead touched the warm quilt. No sobs came. No sound at all. Just a silent collapse into grief that had waited far too long to be acknowledged. Because it was true. She had spent months, years, trying not to want it anymore. Trying to kill the dream that everyone had called shameful, impossible. The mark of a woman fundamentally broken. But today, holding that little boy, she had remembered. Remembered what it felt like to love something small and fragile. To want to protect it with every fiber of her being. And now, holding the doll Jonas had carved with his own calloused hands, she knew he had seen it too. Not just her fear or her sadness, but the longing beneath it all. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor wasn't sure if that knowledge scared her or gave her the faintest glimmer of hope. Part 5. The defender the wind carried an edge the next time they ventured into town. The kind that pulled at skirts and dried the corners of eyes. Eleanor walked slightly behind Jonas as always, her basket light, her shoulders straighter than they'd been in weeks. She thought she had become invisible, another fixture of the landscape. She was wrong. Two women stood outside the apothecary, bent over bolts of fabric, their voices low but carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "You hear about that drifter last week? The one who got himself bloodied outside the saloon? What about him?" Said something ugly about Jonas Halton's wife. Called her barren trash. Said she was using that poor rancher for a meal ticket. Next thing anyone knew, his lips were split and his teeth were scattered on the floorboards like dice. The other woman laughed nervously, then dropped her voice to a whisper. Quiet one, that Jonas Halton. But I guess even a quiet man has his limits when it comes to his own. Eleanor stopped moving. Stopped breathing. She didn't turn around, didn't make a sound. She thought of the bruise on Jonas's knuckle last week, dark purple and swollen. The way he'd flexed his hand at breakfast when he thought she wasn't looking. The fresh cut on his forearm that he'd brushed off as fence work. Though it looked nothing like barbed wire damage, suddenly it all made terrible, wonderful sense. The way he always positioned himself between her and strangers in town. The way he stood a little closer when someone stared too long. The way his hand had twitched toward his belt when a drunk man called out something crude from across the street. He had never told her. Never asked for gratitude or acknowledgement. Never made a show of his protection. He had simply stood there, solid and immovable as a stone wall, between her and a world that wanted to tear her down. That night, after the evening chores, Eleanor sat by the window and watched Jonas stack feed sacks in the barn. One arm moved slower than usual, still sore from whatever had happened, but steady, always steady. She bit her lip hard enough to taste copper. She had spent so long being watched like something broken, passed around like damaged merchandise, examined and found wanting. But Jonas had never asked what was wrong with her, never tried to fix her, never treated her like she needed proving. A ranch hand had asked him once, over whiskey and cards, loud enough for others to hear, "What's so special about that quiet little wife of yours, Halton? She don't talk much, don't smile much. What keeps a man interested in that?" Jonas hadn't even blinked. He'd simply looked out toward the darkening pasture, fingers wrapped loosely around his glass, and said, "She makes bread that bites back. I like that. Means it's real, honest work. And I'm not hungry for anyone else's table." The hand had laughed, thinking it was a joke. But Jonas hadn't been joking. His face had remained serious, almost reverent. The next morning, Eleanor found herself alone in the kitchen before dawn. The bread she'd baked the previous day too much flour, edges hard as stone, still sat on the counter, a testament to her imperfect efforts. She hesitated, then cut one thick slice. She poured a touch of honey over it, watching the golden sweetness seep into the dense crumb. On a small scrap of paper, she wrote in careful script, "Even the tough ones get eaten because they're real." She folded the note and placed it beside the bread at Jonas's spot at the table. Then she went to bed without another word, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next morning, she found the plate empty and scraped clean. The note was gone. Jonas didn't mention it when he came in from the morning chores. But when she handed him his coffee, she saw it, the smallest, rarest thing she'd ever witnessed on his weathered face. A smile. Not the polite expression he gave the horses. Not the courteous nod he used with store clerks. This smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. It reached past the careful fence he always kept around himself. And for the first time since arriving at the Halden Ranch, Eleanor felt something warm and unfamiliar unfurl in her chest. A piece of the wall she'd built around her own heart finally beginning to crack dot in that soft, silent moment. The ranch felt less like a place she'd been exiled to and more like a place where she was beginning, against all odds and expectations, to belong. Part 6. The truth-revealed spring arrived gently at the Halden Ranch, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and new growth. Buds appeared on the trees. Calves tested their legs in the morning light, and the air itself seemed softer, full of possibility. Eleanor moved slower these days. At first, she blamed the change of season, then lack of sleep from strange dreams. She attributed the persistent headaches to too much sun, the waves of nausea to bad meat or spoiled milk. But nothing explained the profound heaviness in her chest. The way the world tilted dangerously when she stood too quickly, the persistent ache in her lower back, or the strange flutter deep in her belly that felt both foreign and somehow familiar. She said nothing about any of it, determined to push through as she always had. But the morning she nearly fainted while hanging laundry. Jonas caught her before she hit the ground. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and led her to the wagon with gentle firmness. "We're going to see the doctor," he said quietly, brooking no argument. "Just to be sure you're well." Eleanor tried to protest. She hated doctors, hated the clinical white rooms and the smell of carbolic acid that reminded her of fertility examinations and cold stethoscopes. But Jonas didn't pressure or demand. He simply held the reins, humming a tuneless melody under his breath, giving her space to be afraid. The doctor in town was a kind man in his middle years, with a graying beard and soft-spoken manner. Dr. Samuel Pritchard listened carefully to Eleanor's symptoms, asked questions without judgment, then pressed gently on her abdomen and listened through a wooden device she didn't recognize. After several long moments, he looked up with warm eyes and a gentle smile. "You're not sick, Mrs. Halden," he said carefully. "You're with child." Silence crashed over the room like a wave. Eleanor blinked, then blinked again. "I'm... what?" "Pregnant. About 8 weeks along, if my assessment is correct." She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. Something deep within her cracked open, raw and exposed. Tears welled up, uninvited and unstoppable. But she wasn't smiling, wasn't beaming with joy or glowing with maternal radiance like women in stories. She was shaking, trembling from head to foot, because it wasn't happiness that gripped her first thought, it was terror. The voice came roaring back, her former mother-in-law's words like venom in her ears. "You'll never carry life. You're broken, barren, a waste of a woman." Eleanor covered her mouth with both hands. The room spun sickeningly. "I don't understand," she whispered through her fingers. "What if it's a mistake? What if it's not real?" Jonas moved closer, but not too close, respecting her space even now. He knelt beside the examination table, one hand resting lightly on hers, warm and steady. "If it's real," he said quietly, his voice like solid ground beneath her feet. We welcome it. We prepare for it together. And if somehow it isn't? He paused, making sure she was listening. If it isn't, I stay. Nothing changes between us, Eleanor. Nothing. She looked at him then, really looked. For the first time, she saw the full depth behind his silence. The patience, the careful waiting, the way he had never once reached for her unless she reached first. But what if I lose it? She whispered, voicing her deepest fear. What if my body fails again? What if they were right about me? Jonas's thumb brushed gently across her knuckles. Then we grieve together, he said simply. You won't carry that alone. Not this time. The dam inside her broke completely then. She started to cry in earnest, not from old wounds reopening, but from being truly seen for the first time in her life. From being offered grace instead of judgment. Jonas didn't smile widely or lift her off her feet in the celebration. He simply held her hand, warm and unwavering, an anchor in the storm of her emotions. If you can't believe it yet, he said gently, his voice rough with emotion, then let me believe for both of us. Just until you're ready. That broke her in a different way. Not the shattering of something fragile, but the crumbling of a wall that had been built too high for too long. Finally allowing light to touch the tender places beneath, she leaned forward slowly, uncertainly, and rested her forehead against his shoulder. He didn't flinch or pull away. He simply turned slightly, just enough to let her weight settle against him. Her arms stayed in her lap, not quite ready for full embrace. But her heart, for the first time in years, leaned too. She didn't say thank you. The words would have been inadequate anyway, and in that quiet, unremarkable room, the woman once called barren held within her the tiniest flicker of life. For the first time since she could remember, Eleanor didn't feel cursed or broken. She felt possible, not for the world's approval or her family's redemption, but for herself, and for the man who had never once asked her to prove anything at all. Part 7. Justice arrives. The sky hung heavy with clouds when they came, rolling up the long drive to the Holden Ranch like a storm that had been brewing for months. A wagon, freshly scrubbed but with a noticeable crack in the back wheel, arrived with too much speed. Dust followed it like gossip made visible. Behind it trailed two more horses bearing riders Eleanor recognized with a sickening jolt to her ribs. Thomas Brennan, her former husband, sat stiffly in his saddle. Beside him rode his parents, Nathaniel and Constance Brennan, dressed in their finest clothes despite the dirt road, faces pinched with righteous indignation. Jonas was tending the horses when they arrived. He looked up once, his expression unreadable, then deliberately returned his attention to brushing the Mari's flank. Eleanor stood frozen on the porch, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles went white. Her stomach, just beginning to show the slightest curve beneath her dress, tightened with old fear. Constance Brennan spoke first, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. So this is where you've been hiding, spreading your lies and slander. Eleanor said nothing. Her throat had closed completely. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. He looked thinner, diminished somehow, less like the man she'd married, and more like a boy trying desperately to please his overbearing parents. Nathaniel Brennan puffed out his chest importantly. We've heard the talk circulating. Heard you were claiming to be with child. That's impossible. This girl is barren. Always was, always will be. This pregnancy nonsense is nothing but a stunt, a pathetic attempt to save face. Constance sneered, her lip curling with disgust. Or perhaps the rancher wants to believe in miracles. Maybe she tricked him the same way she tricked us, with false promises and deceptions. People from neighboring farms had begun to gather, drawn by the raised voices and the spectacle. They clustered near the gate, whispering behind raised hands. That's Eleanor's old family. Didn't they claim she was barren? What's this about a child? Jonas stepped forward then, moving with deliberate calm. He wasn't rushed or agitated. In one hand, he held a folded piece of paper. He stopped directly in front of the Brennans and spoke clearly enough for everyone assembled to hear. "This is an official diagnosis from Dr. Samuel Pritchard," he said, holding up the document. "It confirms that Eleanor is pregnant. Nearly 3 months along now." He let the words settle like stones Retrish and Drinton into still water, watching the ripples spread through the gathered crowd. Then he looked directly at Constance Brennan, his voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. "The woman you called useless. The woman you returned to like spoiled goods and proclaimed a disgrace. She is carrying life." His eyes shifted to Thomas, who still stared at the ground as if wishing it would swallow him whole. "You blamed her, shamed her, called her broken, and paraded her failure before the entire community. But perhaps—" Jonas paused, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "Perhaps it was never her at all." He stepped back once, giving space for his words to land with full impact. Maybe the man was the one who could not produce an heir. Gasps rippled through the assembled crowd like wind through wheat. Heads turned toward Thomas, whose face had gone deathly pale. Constance Brennan's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her face cycling rapidly from red to white. Nathaniel Brennan looked as though he'd been struck. "How dare you?" Constance finally managed, her voice shaking. "How dare you suggest—" "I'm suggesting nothing," Jonas interrupted calmly. "I'm stating a fact. Eleanor is carrying my child. She was never barren. Perhaps the fault always lay elsewhere, and it was simply easier to blame a woman than to question a son." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes meeting Eleanor's for the first time. What she saw, there wasn't anger or denial. It was something worse, the dawning recognition of a terrible truth. He'd always suspected but never had the courage to face Dot. No one in the crowd spoke. No one cheered or applauded, but the shift in the air was palpable. The story they'd all believed, the narrative that had defined Eleanor as defective, was crumbling before their eyes. The Brennans turned without another word and climbed back into their wagon. No apology was offered. No acknowledgement of the years of suffering they'd caused. They simply left, their wagon rattling away down the drive, somehow smaller than when they'd arrived, leaving behind a cloud of dust that settled slowly over everything. Jonas walked back toward the stable, his expression unchanged, as if nothing of particular importance had just occurred. Eleanor remained on the porch, rooted in place. She didn't feel victorious or vindicated. She felt something quieter and more profound released. The weight that had pressed down on her shoulders for so long, the shame she'd carried like a physical burden, was no longer hers to bear. It was finally resting where it had always belonged. A few days later, word began to spread through town in the same hushed tones that had once condemned Eleanor. Thomas's new wife, married nearly 2 years now, still wasn't pregnant. Some people blamed nerves. Others attributed it to the altitude or the water. But more and more voices began to whisper a different story. What if it was never the women at all? What if the problem was always him? Poor Eleanor. All those years of shame, and it wasn't even her fault. The tide had turned completely. Eleanor, who had been the subject of cruel gossip and whispered condemnation, now walked through town with her chin higher. Not from pride or arrogance, but because she finally could. Because the truth had set her free in a way that no amount of explanation ever could have. She never gloated. Never threw stones back at those who had wounded her. She didn't need to doubt she had Jonas. She had a child growing within her. And she had peace, the kind that comes not from proving yourself to others, but from finally knowing your own worth. And sometimes she was learning. That was the truest form of justice. to live so fully and well that those who once cursed you are forced to sit in the shadow of your joy, witnessing the life you built from the ashes of their condemnation. Part 8. Home at last, the scent of roasted venison and warm cornbread drifted across the Halden Ranch on a crisp autumn evening. Lanterns swung gently from porch beams and fence posts, casting pools of golden light that pushed back the gathering darkness. Tables had been set beneath the open sky, covered in simple linens and laden with food drawn from the land itself: roasted squash, sweet potatoes, apple tarts still steaming, preserves put up in the summer months. It was the harvest gathering, a tradition in these parts. Jonas had invited the whole territory, and they came. Old ranchers with warm boots and weathered faces, mothers balancing babies on their hips, young couples courting under the stars, neighbors who had once whispered behind Eleanor's back. They were all there now, offering pies and shaking her hand with genuine warmth. No one called her broken anymore. They addressed her as Mrs. Halden or simply Eleanor, asking after the baby with sincere smiles, offering to bring soup or extra cloth when her time came. Eleanor stood beside Jonas, her belly round and prominent beneath a pale blue dress, the fabric soft over her skin. She no longer tried to hide her condition or make herself small. Her hands rested over the curve of her stomach, like a prayer she finally believed would be answered. As twilight deepened into true darkness, Jonas rose from his seat at the head table. He lifted his glass, and conversations gradually hushed. All eyes turned toward him. He looked at Eleanor first, not at the crowd. His voice carried clearly in the still evening air. "Folks around here like to say I married Eleanor to settle a debt," he began, his tone even and matter-of-fact. "That I got myself a wife when what I really needed was another hand on the ranch." A few knowing chuckles rippled through the assembly. Jonas didn't smile. "Truth is," he continued, "I got the better end of that bargain by a considerable margin. I got someone braver than I'll ever be, someone kinder than I deserve, and someone more stubborn than a winter storm that won't break." Genuine laughter now, warmer and more affectionate. He glanced around at the gathered faces, then back to Eleanor. "So tonight I'm not making speeches or grand pronouncements. I'm just saying thank you to her for staying when she could have given up, for building something real out of what started as nothing more than a transaction on paper." Then, slowly and deliberately, Jonas knelt. Not on both knees like a proposal, not with a ring or theatrical gesture. Just one knee, one hand placed over his heart. His weathered face turned up toward hers. His voice dropped lower, more intimate, though everyone present strained to hear. "If you've ever spent time thinking about who you'd want beside you for all your days, through whatever comes, I'd be honored beyond measure to be that man for you. Not because of debts or arrangements, but because I choose you, Eleanor. Every day, I choose you." No one breathed. The entire gathering seemed suspended in that crystalline moment. Eleanor stared down at him, her lips parted, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Her answer wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. She nodded once, then again, more firmly, as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. These weren't tears born from old wounds or ancient grief. These came from finally understanding what it felt like to be chosen without conditions, loved without reservations, valued simply for existing. She reached for his hand and helped him stand. They didn't kiss, not in front of everyone assembled. That wasn't their way. But the manner in which they looked at each other spoke more eloquently than any physical display a depth of understanding and commitment that went far beyond what skin and lips could express. The gathering erupted in genuine applause and joyful calls. Music started up from somewhere, a fiddle and guitar finding a rhythm together. People began to dance and talk and celebrate under a sky brilliant with stars. But Eleanor and Jonas stood together for a moment longer. existing in their own small universe before joining the festivities. The sun hung low the following evening, spilling orange and gold across the hills like liquid honey. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, carrying the scent of sage and coming rain. Jonas rode ahead on his bay gelding, the reins loosed in his capable hands. Eleanor followed on the gentler Mari, one hand resting on the saddle horn, the other curved protectively over her belly where their child grew stronger with each passing day dot in his mind. Jonas could already hear it, the sound of small boots running through the house, laughter echoing off the rafters, tiny hands reaching up to be lifted. A future he'd stopped imagining for himself years ago, now suddenly vivid and real. Eleanor leaned forward in her saddle and rested her cheek briefly against Jonas's broad back. He reached behind without looking, without words, and covered her hand with his own. Rough and warm and steady, they rode like that across the darkening field, two figures and the promise of a third, casting long shadows in the fading light. Far behind them, the voices and concerns of the wider world had gone quiet. The judgment, the condemnation, the years of shame and sorrow, all of it finally left in the dust where it belonged. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor smiled. Not from relief or vindication, but from genuine happiness. From fullness they had once called her empty, barren, a dry well. Now she carried life within her, something real and chosen and desperately wanted. The ranch house glowed warm in the distance, smoke curling from the chimney, a beacon guiding them home. Not the place she'd been sent to in shame and exile, but the place she'd chosen to stay. The place she'd helped build into something that mattered. As they approached the barn, Jonas helped her down from the Mari with careful hands. For a moment, they stood together in the gathering darkness, his arms loosely around her, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered finally, the words encompassing everything she couldn't fully articulate: gratitude for his patience, his protection, his unwavering presence through all the difficulty and doubt. "Nothing to thank me for," Jonas replied quietly, his voice rumbling in his chest. "You did all the hard parts yourself. I just had the good sense to stand back and watch you grow strong." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him, and in his eyes she saw reflected back the truth she'd been so afraid to claim. She was worthy. She had always been worthy, not because of what her body could or couldn't do, but simply because she existed. And no matter what came next, whatever challenges or joys the future held, she would face it all knowing that fundamental truth. The wind shifted, carrying the promise of rain and new seasons. Eleanor took Jonas's hand, and together they walked toward the house, toward warmth and light and the life they were building together. One quiet day at a time, the woman once called barren had found her home at last. Not in a place, but in the radical act of being fully known and choosing, despite everything, to stay. The end.